Welcome back to the Constitutional Clarion. The one word most commonly used to describe the Whitlam dismissal is unprecedented. But was it really? As I've mentioned a number of times in these videos, there were actually quite a few precedents in Australia concerning upper houses blocking supply, vice-regal officers seeking advice from judges about the extent of their powers, and vice-regal officers exercising their reserve powers. There are plenty of myths and tropes about it being only Labor governments who were dismissed because of the actions of conservative upper houses and conservative vice-regal officers who were in league with conservative judges, all acting against the will of the people. But history provides a much richer and more complex story. Following my previous video on 19th century Victorian governments seeking to govern without supply and the punishment of governors for letting it happen, in this video I'm going to outline some of the Victorian crises of the 20th century, much closer to the time of the Whitlam dismissal, which illustrate the lengths to which governors went to ensure the continuity of supply, even if it meant forcing the resignation, that is dismissing, premiers in order to do so. The information I'm drawing on comes from the governor's own files, containing personal notes of events written by the governor and sometimes by the lieutenant governor, who was usually the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. These files give an inside view of events for which we otherwise only had limited knowledge from press reports and the self-serving statements of the politicians involved. For a long period in the mid-20th century, Victoria had three main political parties: the Labor Party, the Country Party, and the United Australia Party, later replaced by the Liberal Party. Despite the two conservative parties, the Country Party and the United Australia Party, having the most in common and therefore seeming to be natural allies, all three parties engaged in betrayal and alliances of convenience in order to gain power. This high level of instability meant that governors in Victoria played a more active role than governors in the other states. While there were other notable crises, I'm going to start with the controversy in 1943 as an illustration of the exercise of a reserve power to dismiss a Conservative Premier. The Country Party was in government under the Premier Albert Dunstan. 3 months after an election had brought it to power, the Labor Party and the United Australia Party voted no confidence in it, with a view to the United Australia Party's leader, Tom Holway, becoming Premier with Labor's support. Dunstan argued against a fresh election as one had been held so recently, and told the governor that neither of the other parties had the numbers to govern. He advised the governor to let him remain in office so that he could renegotiate a coalition with the United Australia Party. The governor refused to accept this advice and told Dunstan that he had to resign along with his government. Now, this was dismissal in all but name. The only difference was that Dunstan was allowed to submit a resignation so that it appeared to the public that he had followed convention and resigned. At this point, the plans of the plotters went awry. The governor asked the Labor leader, John Cain, to form a government rather than Holway. Seeing his chance, Cain accepted, betraying Holway. The governor, after receiving the advice of the Lieutenant Governor, who was the Chief Justice, insisted on Cain giving a written assurance that he could command sufficient support to carry on government. Cain gave that written assurance and was duly appointed as Premier. Now, working on the basis that the enemy of my enemy is now my friend, Dunstan and Holway, who had now both been betrayed by Cain, joined forces. Within 24 hours of being sworn in, the Cain government was defeated on the floor of Parliament upon the adjournment motion. Cain asked for a dissolution, but because the last election had still been very recent, the governor refused him and Cain resigned on behalf of his short-lived government. Dunstan and Holway agreed to form a coalition government, and Dunstan was again sworn in as Premier. Cain angry at his defeat by Dunstan, continued plotting to remove him. On the 25th of September 1945, he succeeded in blocking supply in the Legislative Assembly. He was supported by some renegade Liberals and independents. Dunstan, who had survived many previous crises, did not resign. Kane accused Dunstan of refusing to leave office until he was scraped off the Treasury benches. Rather nicely put, I thought. Dunstan reminded the governor, Sir Winston Dugan, about the previous fiasco involving the appointment of Kane and argued that he, Dunstan, should be granted a dissolution instead. The problem, however, was that an election couldn't actually be held until mid-November because a recent redistribution meant that new electoral rolls had to be prepared. Second problem was that supply was about to run out on the following Sunday. An immediate dissolution would have meant that there was no money to run the government for over 3 months. The governor offered Dunstan a dissolution if he first achieved the passage of supply. The governor stressed that the passage of supply was needed first to obviate the illegality of payments due to the public service or possibly the withholding of such payments during that period. Dunstan went back to the House and sought supply, but he was rejected. The House said it would only grant supply to a new government. The press then criticised the governor for failing to dismiss Dunstan. One editorial said that if the Premier could not carry on the administration of government, the governor was bound to dismiss him and appoint a new government to achieve supply so that an election could be held. If the governor did not act, it said, it may well be the governor who is recalled for failing to fulfil his duty. Dunstan again sought an immediate dissolution. The governor said that he would not be a party to the illegal application of public monies and that he required Dunstan's resignation. Let me just emphasise that and link it back to my previous video on the Victorian supply crises in 1865 and 1878. Governors all had it impressed upon them that they must A, ensure the continuity of supply, and B, not be a party to the illegal spending of public money. And if the price of preventing those outcomes was dismissal of a government, then so be it. This was core to the vice-regal role. The governor knew it in 1945, and Sir John Kerr knew it also in 1975. But going back to 1945, what did the governor do? He dismissed Dunstan, but in doing so, again, Dunstan was permitted to submit a formal resignation. As far as the public was aware, Dunstan had voluntarily resigned in accordance with parliamentary and constitutional convention. The only reason we know that he was dismissed is that this was recorded in a contemporary memorandum written by the recently retired Chief Justice Sir Frederick Mann, who was advising the governor, and he recorded the events as they unfolded. The governor then offered to commission Labor's John Cain to form a government if Cain could give an assurance that he could carry on government. This time, Cain admitted that he could not, but said that he supported a former Liberal Attorney General, Ian Macfarlane, to form a government and would grant him supply. The governor wrote in his personal notes that Macfarlane's support extended to, quote, 5 revolting Liberals, 3 independents and 2 expelled Country Party members who had all blocked supply to Dunstan. Macfarlane was commissioned to form a temporary administration in order to achieve the passage of supply before an election was held. Supply was duly passed and the election was held. There are 4 interesting things that come out of this 1945 skirmish. First of all, it was Labor that blocked supply to bring down a Conservative Country Party government. Second, the Lieutenant Governor, who'd recently retired as Chief Justice, was again involved in advising the Governor on his actions. Third, the Governor's dismissal of Dunstan was again publicly couched as a resignation, avoiding controversy for the Governor and any taint upon Dunstan and his party. And fourth, we see a minority government being formed for the purpose solely of passing supply until an election could be held, as indeed happened in 1975. The result of the election, in this case, was that Keynes' Labor Party formed a minority government with the support of two independents. In October 1947, the Conservatives in the Legislative Council blocked supply to force an election. So here we now move to an upper house blocking supply. It stated that it would only grant supply to cover an election period. Keynes, recognising that he could not govern without supply, requested a dissolution, which was granted, and supply was duly passed to cover the election period. Labor was defeated in the election, winning only 17 seats. Holway returned as Premier, forming a coalition of the Liberal and Country parties, but that coalition soon fell apart. Another election was held in 1950, which also proved inconclusive. The Liberals won 27 seats, Labor won 24, and the Country Party won 13, with one independent Labor member. Holway, leading the largest party, faced the Parliament as Premier, but he was defeated by a combination of the Labor and Country parties. Holway argued for another dissolution on the basis that no stable government could be formed. He said that the Liberals would support neither the Country Party nor Labor to form a government. Neither Labor nor the Country Party would support a Liberal government. The Country Party would not support a Labor government. The only possibility was a Country Party government supported by Labor. But this, he claimed, would result in a fraud on the electorate, as the Country Party only held 13 seats and had received about 10% of the total vote cast. The Governor, Sir Dallas Brooks, after obtaining the advice of the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and, for good measure, another Supreme Court judge, Sir Charles Lowe, refused Holway's request for a dissolution and appointed John Macdonald to lead a Country Party government with Labor support. In July 1952, the Labor Party decided to withdraw its support of the Macdonald government due to its failure to implement some aspects of their agreement. Holway, although now expelled from the Liberal Party, still commanded a rump of dissident Liberals. He joined with Labor to block supply in the upper house. Keynes, who had been the victim of this tactic a few years earlier, seemed to have no qualms about employing it against others. The plan was for Holway to form a caretaker government that would achieve supply and pass redistribution legislation, after which Parliament would be dissolved and a fresh election held on the basis of the new boundaries. Supply was about to run out on the 31st of October. It was blocked in the Legislative Council on the 21st of October. Macdonald asked for a dissolution, pointing out that he still controlled the lower house. Holway told the Governor that he could achieve supply with Labor's support in the upper house and that he was reasonably confident of passing the electoral redistribution bill through the lower house. The Governor then informed Macdonald that he would not grant him a dissolution and would instead appoint Holway to form a government upon the assurance that he could obtain supply by the end of the month. Macdonald was forced to resign despite holding the support of a majority of the Legislative Assembly. After Holway was sworn in, the Legislative Council immediately passed supply until the end of December. Holway's government, however, was then defeated in the lower house by the combined opposition of the Country Party and the Liberal Party. Holway then asked for a dissolution, stressing that he had satisfied the condition of achieving supply, which no other government was able to do. He thought that it would be unfair to allow the Macdonald government to return and gain the benefit of the supply that he had achieved. Macdonald, on the other hand, pointed out to the Governor that Holway had never achieved the support of the lower house, whereas he, Macdonald, retained the confidence of the lower house and should be restored as Premier. Facing this constitutional dilemma, The governor supersized his judicial advice, obtaining advice not only from the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, but also the Chief Justice of the High Court, Sir Owen Dixon. No one seemed to think that this was constitutionally suspect. It was regarded as the appropriate thing to do when faced with a constitutional issue of this kind. The governor, having considered that advice, refused a dissolution to Holway. He offered Holway the alternative of resigning voluntarily or doing it, quote, at the governor's request, unquote, which was the polite term for dismissal. Holway chose involuntary resignation. In this case, Holway actually told the press that he had tendered his resignation, quote, but not voluntarily, unquote. So his dismissal was actually known. MacDonald was then commissioned as Premier on the condition that he sought the dissolution of Parliament and the holding of a general election. MacDonald accepted those conditions and an election was held on the 6th of December. Labor won a majority at that election. Once again, in this episode, we see a Conservative government being brought down by Labor, amongst others, blocking supply, this time in the upper house. The forced resignation of a Conservative Premier who held a majority in the lower house but couldn't obtain supply in the upper house. The forced resignation of a renegade Liberal Premier who could obtain supply in the upper house but not a majority in the lower house. And the advice of not one but two Chief Justices. The final chapter in this story occurs in 1955, which of course was just 20 years before the Whitlam Dismissal in 1975. The Labor Party split in March, threatening to bring down John Keynes' Labor government. Keynes sought to delay facing Parliament in the hope that time would heal the wounds. But supply was about to run out on the 30th of June. Keynes wanted to continue governing until supply ran out and then seek a dissolution. This would have meant governing without supply during the election period until a new government was formed and Parliament returned. The governor, once again, sought advice from the Chief Justice of the High Court, Sir Owen Dixon, who advised that supply should not be permitted to run out. He suggested that the governor tell Keynes that he would not dissolve Parliament until supply was passed, or the possibility of the formation of another government to pass supply was fully explored. This was effectively a warning to Keynes that he would be dismissed and replaced by another government if he continued on his current course. Keynes therefore changed course and faced Parliament in April while supply was still in place. His government was defeated, but as there was supply to cover the election period, he was granted a dissolution and went to the election as Premier. The election was won by the Liberal Party and an era of stability in Victoria then followed. Now, what does all this history tell us? First, it was not unprecedented and extraordinary for a vice-regal officer to seek the advice of a judge about the exercise of the reserve powers. In fact, it was standard practice, and I'll go through that more in another video later. It was also not unprecedented for an upper house to block supply and to do this with the purpose of bringing down a government. It was not unprecedented for a vice-regal officer to dismiss or force the resignation of a chief minister who could not achieve the passage of supply in either house. It was not just Labor governments who were brought down by Conservative forces. Labor was prepared to block supply in the upper house to bring down a Conservative government, and indeed did so. Finally, it tells us that we don't know our constitutional history well enough. What appeared to be so shocking and unprecedented in 1975 would not have been to anyone who was acquainted with this history, which had in fact happened in the previous 30 years, so it was all within living memory. More importantly, the dismissal would probably never have occurred if Whitlam and his advisors had been sufficiently aware of how vice-regal officers had dealt with such controversies in the past and the primary importance that vice-regal officers placed upon maintaining supply and not conniving in unlawful spending. The reserve powers primarily operate in this way, by deterring political action rather than being publicly applied. Thank you for watching again, and do join me for the next video where I will then narrow in on the precedents about blocking supply at the federal level in the Australian Senate. See you then. Goodbye.